Due Process, recipient of 2 Mid-Atlantic Emmy Awards for Outstanding Talk Show Series and Outstanding Public Affairs Series.
It doesn't make sense to me. It just doesn't make sense.
Her husband's killer wants to die. She says, so kill him. But in case after case on New Jersey's death row, the condemned wait out long years of appeals. The law's been back for 16 years, but there's been no execution. So the effort's on to speed things up. New Jersey's elusive death penalty on the docket for this edition of Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process is made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding is provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual, publishers of print and electronic information for and about the legal community, including the Legislative Manual.
Not one execution in the 16 years since New Jersey's death penalty law was reinstated. 14 people on death row, pressure from a public that tends to favor capital punishment. Is it any wonder that the governor is pushing to speed the process? I'm Raymond Brown, and on this edition of Due Process, we'll look at whether it can be done, whether it should be done, what's to gain, and what's at stake. But first, here's Sandy King.
Raymond, it's always inspired strong feeling on both sides. It's influenced elections, triggered demonstrations, and though for a time it was off the books, it's come back with a vengeance nationwide. But there may never have been quite so much controversy as there was this year as Karla Faye Tucker awaited execution.
It seemed like every bit of anger and violence that was in me was just removed at that point. It was like God just took it out of me.
Her apparent conversion was not enough to keep Karla Faye Tucker from execution, but it may have won some new opposition to capital punishment.
Today we're going to have special prayer again for Karla.
It also focused new national attention on how long it can take from the time the crime is done until the death sentence is finally served.
The grisly discovery was made shortly after 7 this morning.
In Tucker's case, that meant from her 2 pickaxe murders in 1983 until her death by lethal injection 15 years later.
This is the way the system has always been done. I'm saying, let's take a look at the system. That's what I'm hoping the commission will do. Let's take a look at the system, and let's see if we can re-examine that system, which we should do anyway. Any system should be re-examined. And in re-examining it, let's find out whether or not we can shorten it without, and that's very important because you're dealing with a man's life, without doing damage to his appeal.
And that's what New Jersey's now set out to do. With a death penalty back on the books since '82, more than 50 people sentenced to die, and still no execution. The governor's appointed a special commission charged with finding ways to speed up the process.
There are the years and years and years of appeals, hearings, and retrials seemingly without end. Justice delayed is justice denied.
Just 1 week after Karla Faye Tucker lost her fight to stay alive, the commission held its first hearing. Its first witness, a woman whose husband was kidnapped and killed by one of death row's longtime tenants.
What happens on that day is my husband left for work as normal.
That was 7 years ago. 7 years that have been filled, she says, with anguish and fear and appeals for John Martini.
My husband was found the next day, shot with 3 bullets in the back of his head, 5 minutes away from my home.
But ironically, the man who Flack says she fears still is as anxious to end it all as she is to see him go.
Jail's a bad place. Food is bad. Extortion, stabbings, a lot of noise, 30.
So 2 years ago, multiple murderer John Martini asked that his appeals be ended, that he be allowed to die, as sentenced by lethal injection.
His feeling was, and I think it's an absolutely rational one, that I would rather be dead than to have to endure the kind of existence I have to endure in prison, including strip searches every time he had to leave his cell. So he made the decision that he wanted to die, and he did not want these appeals that the public defender wanted taken to be taken.
But the state Supreme Court ruled that appeals by the public defender would go on, despite Martini's wish that they stop.
So New Jersey is the only state that I am aware of that does not permit a person in Mr. Martini's position to make an election to have the appeal stopped.
Segas is, ironically, a death penalty opponent, but his fight for Martini's execution goes on. His effort now to keep the public defender from using information in appeals that he says would violate the attorney-client privilege.
But already this process has been extended over his objection. Already we're getting close to 2 years. Exactly. So this could have ended very early on. I may not even have needed to come into this case if his wishes had been honored.
But not even all capital punishment proponents agree that there should be the right to say stop.
Well, I harken back to my own case. Kadadish stood up with his lawyer when he was sentenced to death.
In the Amy Hoffman.
Right. And he said he wanted no appeals. He wanted to be put to death within 60 days.
O'Brien's own daughter Deidre was murdered by a serial killer who was sentenced to die in another case. But O'Brien, like the court, opposed his wish to forego appeals.
As tempting as it was then for me to agree with Kadadish, as tempting probably as it is with people to agree with Martini's.
Like Mrs. Flax?
Right. There could be, I thought I'd never say this, there could be the possibility that even though they want to be put to death, that they didn't commit those crimes, or that they got an unfair trial. And I think in that case, then you have to go through the appeal process.
And the James Kadadish death sentence after 7 years was overturned, as most of them have been. He's now serving 2 life terms.
I can tell you firsthand, it is a painful, painful process for the victim.
But there are still 14 on New Jersey's death row, and some have been there for a decade or more. Robert Marshall for hiring a man to kill his wife in 1982. Unless Martini finally gets his way, Marshall is likely to be the first to die in this never-used death chamber.
This is the execution chamber.
But even Marshall may still be years from this room.
When your life hangs in the balance, we must, as a society, ensure that no life is taken unless the process is absolutely fair and the record has been meticulously gone through.
Why in the world should a fair trial and appropriate appeals take 10 or 12 or 15 or 18 years? To those who say it's just the nature of the process, I reply, well, then let's change the process.
The Zimmer panel is officially called the Study Commission on the Implementation of the Death Penalty, and speed clearly is the goal. In fact, there seems to be only one commission member, a representative of the public defender, and Raymond will meet her, who goes into the process not convinced that the process can be speeded up. But there is an irony here. The governor named the commission last August and ordered a report in 6 months, but Raymond, it took 6 months for that panel to hold its first hearing.
Sandy, and when we come back, we'll talk to 3 lawyers who've dealt with the death penalty from different perspectives: a prosecutor, a defense attorney, and a law professor. So stay with us.
I believe in capital punishment. You commit the crime, you should be able to do the time.
If there are people on death row, I say use it. It's there to use it. I'm for the death penalty anyway, so.
That's a tough question, you know. I'm not for the death penalty anyway because I don't believe in taking life regardless. So, that's a tough call, man. It's a tough question to answer. That's a tough call, man. It's a tough question to answer.
Someone murdered someone, and if found guilty, should be, punished. I mean, and that at that point in time, I would say yes to a death penalty, not for minor crimes. I mean, so I think that's a fair system. If you kill someone, you get killed.
Almost everyone has an opinion about the death penalty, but what about speeding up the appeals process in New Jersey? Here with me in Trenton is Kathy Walder, former president of the Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers of New Jersey, who's tried 3 death penalty cases. And Boris Mochula, a prosecutor in Passaic County and a member of the Governor's Death Penalty Commission. And joining us in Newark is Professor Joseph Krikora of Seton Hall Law School, who's represented 14 defendants in death penalty cases. I'm going to start with you, Kathy. First of all, we're going to clarify the fact that you are in private practice. You have been for some time and doing quite well, but you are the public defender's designee on the commission. So you're involved in the commission's work. And I also wanted to start by asking you a question that I've heard people say around the state, and that is, the legislature passed the death penalty. The Supreme Court has essentially said it's constitutional. The question is, why does it take so long for the process to run its course? Why are people on death row 14 years, and why shouldn't that be changed?
Well, it takes so long because we're protecting people's lives, even though the legislature has deemed it necessary to have the death penalty and ultimately put them to death. We need to protect their rights. We need to be sure that, in fact, they committed the crime. We need to explore every possible avenue if, in fact, we're going to end their lives.
Now, Boris, if Kathy's correct, then the time that it's taking to get people from the beginning of the process to the end is because we're concerned about due process and fairness. How then are you going to speed things up?
We're certainly concerned about due process and fairness, but there's a limit. There's a limit as to how many times a defendant should have an opportunity to have a case reviewed. Right now we have something close to a 10 or 11-step system, both in the state and the federal courts. That's too much. At least the suspicion is that that's too much. The commission is going to be looking at different areas of the death penalty process to determine whether there could be some type of shortening of it, but not at the expense of basic rights and a defendant's right to have a case reviewed.
Kathy, if there are 11 or 14 steps, as Boris says, can the same thing be accomplished in a shorter amount of time? That seems like a very long time to people who don't know anything about the legal system. What's going on in those 14 years? What's going on in the 11 or 12 hearings that seem to be involved?
Reviews at every level, the federal level, the state level, even the trial court level. Sometimes there's scientific evidence, sometimes there's newly discovered evidence, sometimes there are constitutional issues or constitutional rights that have been snipped or clipped by a judge in a charge to the jury. Raymond, I have to say, if we're thinking about killing people, if we're thinking about putting people to death for any reason, shouldn't we be sure that the person has had every opportunity to in fact have a fair trial and every opportunity for their verdict to be secure?
Boris, it's hard to believe that we're speaking the same language, because Kathy's saying this time is well spent and essential, and you're saying it may be or it is a waste of time. How does the citizen who hasn't spent a lot of time in court or hasn't read all those books in the library, how does the citizen figure out which makes more sense?
I think a citizen has to look at the fact that there's one very exacting review process, and in New Jersey we have it. Our courts have been very stringent in reviewing cases. They raise issues that no one else raises in terms of the parties in the cases. They look at it exhaustively. Once we have that initial appellate process and every issue is looked at, and then there's a second aspect of proportionality review, which is a comparison to other cases, there comes a point at which we're sure that this is the person, that this person received a fair trial, and frankly, this person is eligible to be executed under our law.
Joe, let me bring you in here, and I've known you as an advocate and opponent of the death penalty. Let me ask you to put on your professorial hat and help us explain why there seems to be this vast difference between those who say you need 14 or 16 years to effectively make sure due process is done, and those who say it's a waste of time and we're just avoiding the inevitable.
Well, you know, Raymond, part of the problem here is, I think, is the perception of the length of time. If you think about it in a historical context, we've had the death penalty back on the books now for 16 years. During the first 10 years of that, roughly, the New Jersey Supreme Court overturned a number of death penalties. But that was part of a process by which the law had to be interpreted. Remember, we didn't have this statute in effect before 1982. So, yes, it is taking whatever number of years it's been to this point, but you can already see that over the last 5 years, the New Jersey Supreme Court has upheld 8 death penalties. These cases are going well into the appellate process. And I think that what people need to understand is that if you look at the big picture, I'm not so sure that the process is taking too long, quote unquote. In fact, I think you're going to see, even if there are no changes in that process, that it's going to speed up by virtue of the fact that the law has been clarified and there are fewer issues to debate.
Joe, is that a prediction that in the near future there are going to be executions in New Jersey?
Well, you look at Robert Marshall, he's probably the farthest along on death row in New Jersey. He's in federal court now. That means he's nearing the end because...
When you say nearing the end, what do you mean? Months, weeks, years?
I would think, you know, he may be able to keep the process going another couple years. But even in federal court now, Congress has cut back on the right of habeas corpus, which is the way that death row inmates get into federal court and seek further review of their sentences. So I think the point I'm trying to make is let's not overstate this case that the process is too slow. The system's got to be fair. Nobody would quarrel with that. And if seeking that fairness takes time, I'm hard-pressed to see where the problem lies.
Kathy, some people say that part of the time that we've used in reviewing death penalty cases is because the former and late Chief Justice of our Supreme Court was secretly opposed to the death penalty and was elongating the process in order to subvert it. Is there any truth to that?
I don't believe there's any truth to it. If you read the opinions, you can see clearly there were errors on the trial level where the cases were reversed and overturned and remanded for life sentences. I don't think that was a folly or a whim by the chief at all.
Now, Boris, there are at least some folks who I think might be in your side of the table in terms of their view of the death penalty who have made that charge that the court, and I'm not making an assault on the late chief, but that the court, as it was constituted, really was opposed to the death penalty, didn't want to challenge the legislature, and was in a sense subverting the death penalty by its own jurisprudence. Do you think there's any legitimacy to that?
I think the court in the early days was very hesitant and extremely reluctant and perhaps uncomfortable with the notion of the death penalty. But I think at this point the court is sure that the system we have is a fair one. And as Joe mentioned, now there have been more affirmances of death sentences. I don't think there was any type of hidden agenda just to reverse it at any cost.
Well, if you have a court that's more comfortable with the death penalty and which is in fact comfortable that it's reviewed most of the issues, why is it necessary to have a commission to look at the appellate process if there's no sense that the court is being subversive?
Well, because there are aspects of the process, regardless of whether there's an agenda on the part of the court's process or court's thinking or not, that deal with issues that perhaps can be either tightened up or eliminated. Martini, the Martini case in terms of talking.
We should make it clear we're talking about a man who said he wants to be executed. Go ahead.
He asked basically, I want to be executed. I don't want to go to any more appeals. And keep in mind, I noticed that Jim O'Ryan had mentioned that it would be very difficult to say that maybe we should just go with what a defendant wants, that there are certain overriding interests that go beyond that. I fully agree with that. But John Martini is at a stage where he's had his direct appeal, all issues have been explored. He's had that process of comparison with other cases. He's way beyond that. And now he's saying, I don't want to go through the process anymore. I want to be executed in accordance with the law. My point is, we're sure that that's a fair death sentence. We're sure that he's somebody that's eligible to die. And
Joe, and in the report that we showed earlier, Jim O'Brien said he thought New Jersey was the only state which put a roadblock in the way of a man who said he wanted to be executed. Is that true? Is New Jersey isolated in terms of its view that even a man who does want the death penalty has to have some kind of review?
Well, I think he's partly right. I think the reality is that it's a question of how far into the appellate process does one have to go, whether one wants it or not. Frankly, I'm hard-pressed to see why the desire of the convicted murderer plays a particularly great role in this whole process. And I think the point that Boris is making is that Martini has passed his direct appeal. In other words, the Supreme Court of New Jersey has looked at his case and determined that his death sentence was appropriate. But nevertheless, we as a society have interests in the integrity of the process that go far beyond what John Martini does or doesn't want, frankly.
Kathy, I should ask you about Martini, since the office that you represent, even though you're a private lawyer, the public defender essentially said he should have an appellate process. The court should look at his conviction before it grants him his wish to be killed, and he had to hire a private lawyer who advocated for himself, while the office that you're affiliated with now, at least, and used to be associated with, took a position that there should be a review even when he wanted to have the death penalty imposed on himself. What's the rationale for that?
Well, Ray, the thing that bothers me the most about this case is the fact that we are justifying his desires being carried out because he's been found to be competent. Competent, as we all know, is a very low standard. It means you can understand what's going on. You understand that you're being represented. You understand that the man that sits up there or the woman is a judge. I don't think competence is an appropriate level for a person to decide whether or not they should die, unless, of course, they're terminally ill, but that's another show, of course. So I think that in declaring whether or not a man's wishes to die are important or imperative with respect to putting him to death, we're making a big mistake using Mr. Martini as an example of this.
Now, Boris, it's hard to get away from the fact that the governor established this commission during an election year. And there are those who've said, look, the real focus here is on the fact that there's a large percentage of people who favor the death penalty, and the commission was set up really for that purpose, to gather some support from those who favor the death penalty. What's the response to that in terms of your mission?
The commission was formulated prior or during the election year, but there were no members that were selected until this year, after the election, and now we proceed on. We've had hearings at this point, so there's no election issue here. It's just an idea that 15 years into the process, this law deserves to be implemented. There are national statistics dealing with the amount of people that go on to death row versus the amount of people that are executed, and there have been recent articles that say at this pace, more people are likely to die on death row of old age than of execution.
But we saw an early witness, Marilyn Flax, I think the first witness, who is well known as a person who suffered tremendously and is an emotional advocate for greater speed. Is that really part of an analytical approach to whether we can balance due process with moving appeals more quickly?
I think it is. She had some very interesting points, and I'll mention one that I think is very relevant to this process. She mentioned that at the time of John Martini's arrest, one of the things he said was, you can give me the death penalty, but they don't kill people in New Jersey. Here's a killer, here's a murderer, ultimately determined to be eligible for death penalty, who is very well aware that the law in our state simply is not working, and there really is no fear in terms of a deterrence value that the death penalty would ever be imposed. It's those type of issues in terms of victims' testimony that we explored and will continue to explore.
And Kathy Walter, by my poor calculation, you are one person on the commission who can be counted as a death penalty opponent, and presumably one who starts out believing due process has to weigh and we've got to take the time. How can you have any impact? I mean, are you wasting your time being on this commission?
That discussion has come up in the past several weeks. I sat on my first meeting last month, and it was uncomfortable, to say the least. It's uncomfortable to hear victims and victims' families discuss what occurred and the effect it had upon them. I think it's uncomfortable in any situation. But yes, I am the sole objector to the death penalty and the sole objector to speeding up the process. The effect that I can have, I think I balance the process. I'm sure I will be the only vote in many situations when the final report comes out, but I had added at the last meeting several statements that help balance the testimony a little bit, especially after two prosecutors testified.
Joe, to the extent that this process is politically driven as well as legally driven, there's been maybe a subtle change in the way folks think about the death penalty because of Karla Faye Tucker. At least there seems to be renewed debate. Do you see any shifting in how the public views the death penalty and in how the public may respond to the work of this commission?
Well, you know, it's the Karla Faye Tucker thing really hit close to home with me because I just finished a trial here in Newark, a death penalty case in which one of the arguments advanced on my client's behalf during the death penalty phase was that he, like Karla Faye Tucker, had become involved in a number of religious activities in the jail and that he was essentially a person capable of redemption. And so I find myself thinking, yeah, I think there were people out there who felt, gee, Karla Faye Tucker may prove the point that people are capable of redemption, even those who have done the worst crimes. And I guess there probably is some reaction.
Of course, Joe, it could be argued on the other side that had she not had a long appellate process in which to find redemption, that whole process wouldn't have happened.
Right, that's a cynical view that says, in my case, for example, my client had the good sense to have his conversion before he got in front of a jury and could therefore argue at the trial itself that,
let me turn it around and ask Boris, are you saying let's kill them before they have a chance to find redemption and change their view?
Overly simplistic attitude. No, it's not let's kill them. Let's apply the law. Let's determine when the jury is sitting there, what type of factors are involved, what type of factors militate against the death penalty, what type of factors go for it. And you as a jury, as the 12 people that are literally sitting on the case, make a decision. And based on that decision, let's carry out the law. It's true that you have a different...
Can you give us a quick summary on what you expect from this commission, because we're running out of time, and what do you think will happen?
I think ultimately there'll be some recommendations at both the trial stages and appellate stages that things can be shortened up a bit without any effect whatsoever.
What will the new average time be in your view?
New average time? we're on 10 years right now. That's very difficult.
Joe, what do you see coming out of the commission?
Well, I think it's interesting. The law has been changing already in ways that ultimately...
Joe, I'm sorry, we don't have much time. I was hoping you could give me a real quick answer. Maybe there aren't quick answers to this complex question.
No, I think the process is going to be shortened, whether this commission makes changes or not.
It looks like this process is going to have to go fast because we've got to say goodbye. So I want to thank you, Kathy, Boris, and Joe. That's it for this edition of Due Process. But be sure to join us next week when we'll take on yet another tough issue of law and social justice. Till then, for Sandy King and all of us here, I'm Raymond Brown.
The jury found my husband's killer guilty. John Martini has gone through the appeal process twice. The Supreme Court has upheld his decision. And what's really interesting, and I almost said the mic pet right, is that John Martini wants to die, and they won't let him. You have a death penalty, and you have a killer that wants his sentence upheld, and they won't kill him.
Major funding for Due Process was made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding was provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual, publishers of print and electronic information for and about the legal community, including the legislative manual.